All right. Good morning, everybody. Today is the last day that you will have to listen to my video lectures. I know you guys have been so excited to watch them. I'm joking, of course. I understand that this is nowhere near as exciting as my normal lectures are when I'm in person, but it's important for me to be able to deliver to you my lectures, because most of the content that we go over the week and we review all comes from this, and so that's why we're continuing to do this. But this week will be the last week. We won't obviously do this again next week because I will be back next week, and so we'll return to our normal daily life next week. Thank you for doing your work in these 6 weeks that I've been gone. I am recovered and I am ready to return. So, last week we talked about James Monroe. We talked about his early life. We talked about his participation in the American Revolution and the war. We talked about his service in politics, as well as his service specifically working for the various presidents that came before him. And today we're going to talk about just a few brief things about him. Actually, really only two things aside from the election that defined his presidency and are important for you to know about. But first, oh yikes, that's not right. So it's an election this slide is incorrect. It should be election of 1816. That's when he was elected in 1816. So he was basically a shoo-in for the presidency. A shoo-in means that he didn't really have any opposition that was difficult opposition. But people were getting tired of similar presidents. Three of the first four presidents were all from Virginia. That would be Washington, Jefferson, and Madison. Adams, if you remember, was from Massachusetts. And people were tired of these similar type presidents. They had similar political lives. They had similar ideas. They were from similar places. They had similar experiences with slavery. And overall, people grew tired of having the same type of president. It would be like if, we had our next president after Donald Trump was also from New York and was also someone who did real estate and had TV shows. What if the next three presidents after him were all from New York? We would start to feel like people from New York are deciding the way our country should be run, and we would want some president from another part of the country. But again, that didn't really affect whether he was going to win the presidency because he was a shoo-in, again, which means that there was no one standing really in opposition. His main opponent was a guy named Rufus, which is kind of a funny name, Rufus King, and he was actually from New York. Rufus was part of the Federalist Party that Washington and Adams were part of, but the Federalist Party didn't have as many supporters anymore. And so King only ended up winning 3 states. So you remember, in presidential elections, you win states. It's not based on the total number of votes. It's based on how many states you win, because each state has a number of electoral votes, and they add up all the votes at the end, and whoever wins the biggest and the most states typically wins the election. So as you can see, Monroe won 16 states, which is a large amount of states. It's roughly almost 5.3 times as many states as King won. And so ultimately it is clear that Monroe was going to be president. And so the election is really just a formality, and people knew from the beginning that he would win. All right, so there are two main things that we're going to talk about his presidency. One is a domestic issue or event, and the other one is a foreign issue. Domestic means it takes place in the United States and it's about what's going on in the United States. And foreign means it takes place or it's about something outside of the United States. So the Missouri Compromise is the domestic issue. It's the thing that's going on in the United States. And it requires a little backstory. So there was constant fighting in Congress between free states and slave states. The free states didn't like slavery and believed that people should work for wages and that slavery was an evil that we shouldn't have. People in slave states believed that slavery was important to the economy, that slaves or Africans were less than human, and that they were also people's property. And the slave states believed that the northern states were going to try to take their slaves away from them. Okay? And so Monroe believed that there should be an equal number of free and slave states in Congress, because if one side got too much power, then they would try to take the other's rights away. So if there were more free states than slave states, then the free states would try to end slavery. If there were more slave states than free states, slave states would try and expand slavery. And so each side was worried that the other side would get too much power and would use that power to get what they want. In 1819, there were 22 states equally divided between free and slave. So there were 11 free states and 11 slave states, which made it perfect because in the Senate, where each state gets 2 senators, there was an equal number of both, and so one couldn't have more power than the other. Now, Missouri was a territory that wanted to become a state of the United States. But they wanted to enter the United States as a slave state. Now you can see how this would disrupt the balance, because now you would have 23 states in the Union, 12 of them being slave and 11 being free states. And so people in the North were worried, for good reason, that this would mean that the slave states could now control the policy and allow slavery to continue to expand in the United States. Now, whether that be true or not, we don't know, but it was what they believed, and so it's how they acted. Now, here's what happened. The slave states, when they started to debate whether they should allow Missouri to come in, argued that states should have the right to choose whether they allow slavery or not. This idea of popular sovereignty, which is the idea that people should choose the things that they want, is something that we deal with almost every year and in all over places in the United States. So, for example, one big issue in the United States that's similar to this one is the issue of marijuana. Marijuana has been legalized in California, and Californians believed that they had the right to legalize it for people of the age of 21 to consume recreationally, meaning for fun, that they had the right to choose that. Now, the federal government, so the national government, it's still illegal at the national level. So the national or federal government, our government, could come in and arrest somebody for selling marijuana in California, even though it's legal here. And so the slave states are kind of like California. They argued that people should get to choose whether something should be illegal or not. Now, the northern states, on the other hand, believed that the national government should and has the right to outlaw slavery in future states, that they should control what happens in these future states that don't even exist yet. And so this is the key debate here. And this debate will come up again and again and again as we talk about slavery, which is, should people get to choose whether slavery is legal in each state as it becomes a state, or should the national government say, here's our policy, and this policy will go on forever? And that's the question open for debate. So, what did James Monroe, who did he side with? Well, James Monroe was actually pretty smart and chose not to take a side, but instead wanted to seek a compromise so the U.S. wouldn't break apart. There was always this question since the beginning of the Constitution that the differences between the slave states and the free states would eventually cause the United States to break apart, which is what the Civil War is about. And so there was a constant worry by politicians that if things got too heated between free and slave states, that would start the process of breaking the United States into two pieces. the southern part of the United States becoming its own country and the northern part of the United States becoming its own country. So instead of having one United States, we would have, possibly the northern United States and the southern United States, and those would be two different countries. So James Monroe wanted to do everything in his power to prevent this. And so he wanted to seek a compromise. Compromise, if you remember, is where one side gets a little bit, another side gets a little bit, but no one gets all of it. So for example, if one of the students in this class right now, let's say Malik raises his hand to use the restroom, and he's demanding to go to the restroom right now, and I say, well, we're in the middle of this PowerPoint lecture. I don't think I can let Malik go to the restroom. And Malik says, please, 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 please. And I say, okay, you can go in 10 minutes. And Malik agrees. We've just compromised. We've just come to a solution where I'm allowing him to go to the restroom, which is what he wants, and he has agreed to stay for 10 more minutes so he can finish this PowerPoint lecture. And that's a compromise. So here's what their compromise looked like. So the free states, the states in the north, gained Maine as a free state. So Maine, which is our northernmost state in the United States, came in as a free state, not because they wanted to necessarily come in as a free state at that moment, but because they needed a state to balance out Missouri. Missouri did enter as a slave state. So each side got one more state. So now we have 24 states with 12 free and 12 slave. They also drew a line, which we'll look at more tomorrow, across the states at 3630, which is longitude, latitude. And this line basically dictated that slave states would be allowed to come into existence below the line. So as the United States expanded westward, the slavery could only exist below this line, and then free states would be above it. So any new states that would come into existence above the line had to be free states where there was no slavery. And so Monroe quickly signed this compromise into law. This would not be the last compromise with slavery. There would be another big compromise, the Compromise of 1850. That would really accelerate the process of leading to the Civil War. But this was kind of the first step in dealing with this argument between northern and southern states about whether slavery should expand or not. So those are the domestic issues, and now we're going to talk about the foreign issues. So the foreign issues are related to the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, Monroe Doctrine, 2 words. Monroe, obviously the person's name. Doctrine is a word that means like a set of ideas or beliefs. So, we all have heard the phrase Latin America, and Latin America refers to countries south of the United States that either speak Spanish or Portuguese as their main language. And these countries were colonized by either Spain or Portugal, typically. And these countries, or colonies, because they were controlled by someone in Europe, wanted freedom in the same way that the United States got freedom from Great Britain. So they watched our revolution and they said, we want that same freedoms that people in the United States fought for, and we want to do the same thing to get free of Spain. So they ultimately would push for revolution. Revolution is just like American Revolution. A revolution is the general word, just means to fight against the government to free yourself from the government. And the main opponent was Spain. Spain was in control of most of the colonies in Latin America, which is why most of the people from Central or South America either, mainly speak Spanish, and that language comes from Europe. It's not a language that comes from Latin America. And the reason why is that Spain brought their culture and colonized these countries and taught them their language. And so the reason why Spanish is a commonly spoken language is because of the intervention of Spain in Latin America. There are plenty of native languages that are spoken in Latin America and in Mexico and in Central America, but the main language is Spanish, and that's because Spain was involved. So Monroe was concerned about this, though. He worried um, if he supported these countries seeking freedom, just like they did, that this might start a war with Spain. And the United States wasn't prepared to go to a war with Spain. Spain was not the most powerful country, but the United States had recently gotten out of the War of 1812, and they weren't eager to get involved in another conflict. And so there was rumors going around as well that Spain was gathering allies, so talking to other countries in Europe and saying, our colonies in Latin America are trying to seek freedom like the United States, and you guys have to help me stop them. Otherwise, your guys' colonies will want to take freedom, want to have freedom as well. Ultimately, Monroe decided to recognize and support these countries in their seeking freedom. The main ones are Argentina, Peru, Colombia, Chile, and Mexico. And so he sought and made a public recognition of these countries, which means when you recognize that their revolts are happening, what you're saying is, I see these people as right and Spain is wrong. And so he did this, and it was a really big statement to people in Europe that the United States was siding with Latin America over Europeans. Ultimately, though, he wanted to make an announcement to set a policy for how the United States would proceed in the future with dealing with Latin American countries seeking freedom. So he made an announcement. It was a public announcement. It was a speech. So he read this out loud to a group of people. And this speech would later be called the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine would last into the 20th century. And this doctrine would become one of the most important policy documents, or one of the most important speeches in U.S. history. So what does the Monroe Doctrine say? Well, it's got four main parts that you need to know. Part number one, the U.S. would be neutral in all European wars. So there was a lot of conflicts in Europe, wars between different countries, and the United States was trying to avoid getting involved in these conflicts so they can appear and remain neutral. The reason being is that it was very expensive, and the United States wanted to trade with all of the different European countries without getting involved with them. Part two, Europeans could not, or were not allowed to reconquer old colonies. So if, let's say, Argentina sought freedom from Spain, Europeans could not reinvade Argentina to take it over again. Basically, once a country had revolted and become free, they were not allowed to be reconquered by Europeans. Part three, Europeans could not stop the revolutions in Latin America. So if a Latin American country is seeking freedom and they're fighting against their oppressors or the people that were running the colony, Europeans could not send additional troops to help stop the revolution. And then finally, part number four, Europeans could not conquer new territory in Latin America. So they couldn't come and take over a piece of land that was unoccupied by other people. Basically, Europeans were not allowed to get involved in Latin America anymore. And so this was a big document. It was basically establishing the United States as the protector. Now, most Europeans did know that the U.S. probably couldn't stop them from doing something. If Spain sent a bunch of troops to Latin American countries, the U.S. probably couldn't get involved enough to stop the Spanish. But Great Britain decided that they wanted to support this U.S. policy and promised to use their navy to help. So even though the U.S. couldn't handle it themselves, the British saw this as an opportunity to stick it to Spain, who was one of their opponents. And so they supported this U.S. policy by using their giant navy to stop other countries from, particularly Spain, from getting involved. Because these colonies gave a lot of money to Spain, and Spain used them for resources, which then they would use to fight wars in Europe. So Great Britain saw this as a way to hurt Spain, even though it was a U.S. policy. And then France, who was allied with Spain, promised not to help Spain with the colonies. So the French did not want to make the Americans their opponents, and so they said that they promised that they would no longer try to get involved with Spanish colonies. So why is the Monroe Doctrine significant? Significant means why is it important? The doctrine was a big move by Monroe to establish the United States as the big brother or the protector of the Western Hemisphere. Western Hemisphere basically just means North and South America. And so by doing this, the United States was setting itself up as the ultimate guardian of protecting freedom in Latin America. Now, later on, the United States would get involved in Latin America in ways that weren't as noble or good as this way initially, but it was important for the freedom of most countries, and in particular, the country right below us, Mexico, that the United States set itself as a protector in Mexico getting freedom from Spain. And so this policy would continue for more than 100 years. It would remain our policy for quite some time, and it would even still be in effect really until almost the time that I was born. And so this is James Monroe's most significant achievement, and it's the thing he's most remembered for. So here's a deep thinking question, and we don't need to answer this now, but I want you to be thinking about it because we'll be writing about it at some point this week. And it's the basic idea, and this is just it's an opinion question. So, there are different ways you can look at this. Should the U.S. get involved in other countries' government issues? So, for example, there are some countries that have dealt with a lot of gang warfare. So, for example, in El Salvador, right now, there's a lot of violence going on in these countries. Is that something that the U.S. should send troops in to get involved to stop the violence? Is that the U.S.'s job to get involved in other countries like that? Or, if there's a terrorist cell in another country, should the U.S. invade that country in order to destroy that terrorist cell? These are all questions that there are no right or wrong answers to. They're just opinions. And so it's important to think about because the United States is constantly getting involved in other countries' business. And the big question is, should we or should we not do that? And that's what the Monroe Doctrine is about, is getting in other countries' businesses. And ultimately, you'll need to decide as you grow up and you start to vote in elections whether you think the U.S. should be more or less involved with other countries. All right, so make sure you take the quiz and make sure you're studying your vocab for the week.